The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to speak once again on Bill S-217, known as Wynn's Law. It is a simple bill. It is a straightforward bill to close a fatal loophole in the criminal code that cost Constable David Wynn his life when he was murdered by someone who was a career criminal who was out on bail. And one of the reasons he was out on bail was because his extensive criminal history hadn't been brought to the attention of the judge at the bail application hearing. And one of the reasons why that information was not presented was because currently under the criminal code, leading such evidence of the criminal history of bail applicants is discretionary, even though it is always relevant and material to the question of bail. It is with considerable disappointment that the Liberal-dominated Justice Committee voted to recommend that Wynn's Law not proceed. Madam Speaker, this is a common-sense bill. But as is so often said, common sense isn't so common. And if ever there was a better illustration of that truism, it is the Liberal opposition to passing this legislation. Madam Speaker, let's be clear about what the Liberals voted against in recommending that this House not proceed with Wynn's Law. They voted against changing one word in the criminal code. And the member for Mount Royal is shaking his head, and he shouldn't be, because, Madam Speaker, the fact of the matter is the essence of Wynn's Law has always been about changing may to shall in Section 518 of the Criminal Code so that Section 518 would read that a prosecutor shall lead evidence of the criminal history of a bail applicant rather than its current wording, which provides that a prosecutor may lead evidence of the criminal history of a bail applicant. That's always been the essence of the bill, and, Madam Speaker, I was prepared to make all amendments necessary so that not only the essence of the bill would be that, but that, in fact, that's all the bill would be. And notwithstanding that, the Liberals had absolutely no interest in accepting that amendment. So the Liberal record on this bill is very simple. It's very clear-cut, and it is in opposition to changing that one word. Now, I expect the member for Mount Royal, or whatever Liberal gets up to speak, will say it's a little more complicated than that, but I say it isn't in the face of that fact. And so, I would expect that the member for Mount Royal and whatever other Liberal stands up in this place to defend what I would submit was an indefensible decision coming out of the Justice Committee is that they will hide behind certain groups that came out in opposition to the bill while probably selectively ignoring other groups like the Canadian Police Association, which represents some 60,000 frontline police officers. But one can say this group supported Wynn's Law and this group opposed Wynn's Law. But, Madam Speaker, that's not the issue. That's not what is relevant. What is relevant is the evidence. The evidence at committee on the specific question of changing one word, may to shall. And in that context, the question of leading criminal history of bail applicants at bail hearings. That's the question. So, Madam Speaker, what was the evidence before the Justice Committee? The evidence was, Madam Speaker, that witness after witness after witness said that the criminal history bail applicants is always relevant and material on the question of bail. Indeed, the president of the Canadian Association of Crown Counsel testified before the committee saying that it was the bread and butter of what prosecutors do. He said it is the first thing that prosecutors learn to do when they learn how to handle a bail hearing. And not only that, Madam Speaker, not one witness provided a credible example of when a prosecutor should appropriately withhold evidence of the criminal history of a bail applicant. So, Madam Speaker, in the face of that evidence, it really does beg the question, how in the world could any fair-minded and reasonable person oppose changing may to shall in Section 518 of the Criminal Code? Well, Madam Speaker, there were three main arguments, at least, three semi-cogent arguments that were put forward against changing that one word. One argument that was repeated a number of times was that Wynn's law would somehow interfere with prosecutorial discretion. Interfere with prosecutorial discretion, even though not one witness was able to present one credible instance of when it would be appropriate for a prosecutor to exercise discretion in withholding evidence about the criminal history of a bail applicant. Madam Speaker, Wynn's law doesn't interfere with prosecutorial discretion because leading evidence about the criminal history of a bail applicant shouldn't be a matter left to discretion. Another argument that was put forward, I would submit a rather bizarre argument, was the notion that Bill S-217 would somehow increase the evidentiary burden placed upon prosecutors, and that as a result of that increased evidentiary burden would actually make it more difficult for prosecutors to keep dangerous criminals behind bars. The only problem, Madam Speaker, with that argument is that Bill S-217, Wynn's law, has absolutely nothing to do with increasing the evidentiary burden. All Wynn's law required was that prosecutors lead evidence of the criminal history of bail applicants. The burden, the evidentiary standard, is provided for in a totally different section of the criminal code, or a different subsection, section 518 sub 1 sub e, that provides that a judge may accept evidence that is credible and trustworthy. Wynn's law, Madam Speaker, does not change that standard. And then, Madam Speaker, there was the argument of delay. It was asserted that somehow Wynn's law would cause a backlog in the courts, that it would make bail applications longer. Madam Speaker, it is frankly difficult to accept that argument in the face of evidence that this is something that is almost always done. So making something that is almost always done, pretty difficult to imagine that in that context that suddenly there is going to be a massive backlog in our courts. Then the question becomes, in the case where perhaps a bail hearing might take a little longer, what sort of bail applicants would see perhaps a few extra minutes to lead evidence? It certainly wouldn't be in the case of a bail applicant who had no criminal history, because in such case there would be no criminal history to lead evidence of. But in the case of career criminals, in the case of someone like Sean Rain, who shot and killed and murdered Constable Wynn, and shot Auxiliary Constable Derek Bond, with his more than 50 prior criminal convictions, yes, it might take a few minutes to lead evidence about that individual's, that career criminal's history. And so it should, Madam Speaker.
Hear, hear.
Extending it by a few minutes is a small price to pay. And let me just say very quickly in closing that Constable Wynn's killer's bail hearing was a very efficient bail hearing, but it had very fatal consequences.